Needs a watchdog. We have with us today the National Vice President of the BJP, a four-time parliamentarian and the author of a book called Lutyens' Maverick, Mr. Baijayant Panda, a short audio-visual, and then Mr. Baijayant Panda's perspective on this issue.
Fake news, false reports, disputable coverage. Is self-regulation sufficient to combat the menace? Are enough safeguards in operation? Or does the media now need a watchdog? Now on the NBF National Conclave, addressing the big question, does media need a watchdog?
I request Mr. Baijayant Panda to please take the stage. Mr. Baijayant Panda, please. The stage is yours, sir.
Thank you for this opportunity to speak at the NBF Conclave on this topic, which I think remains perennially relevant and important. Does the media need a watchdog? This is an age-old question. This is not something that has suddenly come out of the blue, and this goes back decades and even centuries, because certain elements have always attempted to manipulate, control, dominate the media in ways that are not legitimate, that are not ethical. So if we go back to the issue of freedom of speech and our constitutional guarantees of freedom of expression, right towards the last few decades of colonial rule, where there were attempts to have a modern, world standard freedom of speech right built into our constitution and our laws, those who led the nation in those last decades of colonial rule and in the first few years of independent India, they let us down because they entered qualifications to those rights which have then been subsequently manipulated over the decades. Many of you will remember, at least those from my generation, if not the younger ones, way back in the 1980s, when Rajiv Gandhi was Prime Minister, there was an attempt to foist a governmental control, a watchdog over media, and that led to a furore, and that plan was dropped. From time to time, some people have tried to come up with these ideas, but look at how media has behaved itself. It's worth looking at legacy media. Look at the marquee names in media. Many of them, in fact, I would go to the extent of saying most of them, have been guilty of misrepresenting facts on the ground, which the larger public didn't always understand, and once they understood, it has not been that easy to do away with it. Many legacy media would report a riot or a murder in starkly different ways, depending on whether the perpetrator was from a particular religion, whether the victim was from a particular religion. The descriptions and whether the names of the perpetrators were to be disclosed would depend on that metric, on that prejudice, on that narrative. And that narrative was set right here in the heart of the country, in this core part of the national capital, which has been called the Lutyens zone. And the media and the narrative setters who made their homes here for decades were all guilty of it. Now, this is not something that has gone away, but because of more awareness, and I believe because of the explosion in media, there's new media that takes on traditional media, both in broadcast, in digital, and other traditional formats, although you don't see print media new entrants very much. So, what some of the member broadcasting entities of NBF, for instance, have shown, and shown very assertively over recent years, were for decades actually actively suppressed, as I have just been explaining to you. Now that has questioned the power equations in a manner which has disturbed those who have wanted to control the narrative, those who have wanted to control media, and you have seen the result of that. You have seen the results. My friend Arnab Goswami has been the victim of an attempt by a state government which took upon itself to quote-unquote regulate media. Of course, I use that term facetiously, because what they did was break every norm of constitutionality, every norm of legality, every norm of ethics, and every norm of plain common decency. Now, the question is, if you were to have a regulatory body for media, how would it work? It's not that we haven't had them. We've had, for example, the Editors Guild of India. How have they acquitted themselves? We've had the Press Trust of India. How have they acquitted themselves? Have they stood up for the rights of citizens? Have they stood up for bold journalists exposing facts? Sadly, more in the exception than in the norm. And particularly if they fit a certain set of media entities, particularly the legacy ones. Self-regulation, it's an ideal, it sounds wonderful. But let me ask you, all you people from the industry, if self-regulation was working, why did you need a new federation? Because the entrenched vested interests of media have never allowed real self-regulation to operate properly, to operate freely. The entrenched interests of legacy and of large media, especially those with a great deal of investments from around the world, have always believed in creating dominance in ways that would not be approved of as a level playing field, where they have been anti-competitive. Some of that has been discussed in a couple of the panel discussions that I was pleasantly surprised to listen to a little bit earlier. Now, I don't want to speak for very long, because I believe the point is succinct enough that we don't need to keep beating a dead horse. But I would be remiss if I didn't refer to a very blatant example of some sections of the media's egregious behavior, which begs the question of, do they need regulation, and in what manner? Recently, a very well-known online platform has been caught fabricating news, concocting conspiracy theories, fabricating documents, fabricating emails, to make a claim in support of a narrative, trying to paint a negative picture of India, trying to paint a negative picture of government, trying to paint a picture of online platforms being in bed with government, which was just not the case. Now, how did this get exposed? Over a 2-week period, it just so happened that they took on a global new age social media platform which ferociously denied it. Now, instead of acknowledging that there was a denial, instead of reviewing the material on which this social media platform which is an established anti-government platform. They never have anything good to say about the government or the country. Instead of reviewing, they doubled down, tripled down, quadrupled down on their efforts to continue the fabrications. To justify one lie, they had to make up more lies. To justify that, they had to make up more lies. How did it get exposed? Not because of any regulatory body. Not because of a media watchdog. Certainly, if there had been a media watchdog newly created by the government, there would have been outrage. There would have been real reaction amongst large sections of people, at least the commentariat. Did the Editors Guild speak up and condemn them for fabricating such fake news? Did any of the industry authorities speak up against them? They were exposed because globally, tech geeks took it upon themselves to expose this fake news, the fake doubling down, and the fake fabricated documents and emails which came out. Now that's a great example, but it's also a telling story in itself. Because this particular platform and some of their ilk this is not the first time they've done it. They have repeatedly planted fake news, but when it is countered, the counters are dismissed as if it is just a routine dismissal, instead of going into the merits. This time, the fake news was exposed because it became global, because tech geeks around the world who have no particular interest in Indian politics took it upon themselves to expose the fraud, to expose this fake news. Now, that won't always happen. We need to have such credible, crowdsourced efforts to expose fake news in India. Social media is helping to do that. I think it is a work in progress. I think such examples that I have just cited mean that we are progressing towards an era where this kind of blatant, premeditated fake news is going to get exposed more and more. Now, whether government should have a role, whether people should have a role, whether there should be independent crowdsourced efforts, whether there should be an entity, perhaps of in the direction of self-regulation, perhaps a federation of broadcasters and digital content platform entities, maybe even legacy media, print entities, to take it upon themselves to have a charter, to talk about how media should behave and how their self-regulation should work. Now that would be ideal, but can it happen? I throw this open as a challenge to those of you in the industry to try and help make it happen. Because otherwise there will always be calls for regulation because of these kind of premeditated narratives and conspiracies, and that's not healthy for the media in the long run. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to speak to you. Jai Hind, Jai Bharat.
Thank you so much, Mr. Panda, for that very interesting perspective. And of course, we'd like to tell all our viewers watching on their screens at this point that this conclave is streaming live on 40 channels as the discussions continue. So we are set to begin with the next session.
Absolutely. Over 40 channels telecasting, streaming today's inaugural NBF conclave live. So clearly ripples being created across the news industry today with this benchmark conclave, with this new initiative. And of course, remember, it's not just conversation that is happening today, but far-reaching decisions that are also being taken on this stage, which will have a huge impact on the landscape of news and the industry in the country. Today's, of course, conclave is themed Future of News, which is what we are talking about through various sessions. What will the future of news industry be? What will the future role of BARC be as well, which, remember, is the ratings body in the country. We of course are also being joined through the day by various stakeholders from the political world as well. We of course had the former Vice President kick things off in the morning. We will be having the Governor of Kerala as well, in the latter half of the day. We just heard, of course, from Member of Parliament, Mr. Baijayant Panda. We'll soon be joined by a senior minister in the government of India as well. And clearly, of course, the attempt being made today is to create a change in the news industry through a more equitable, more representative federation, that is the NBF. And of course, the inaugural conclave is all about that.
Absolutely, and like Arnav put it, it is really the exchange of views that will pave the way forward when it comes to the future of the media and the kind of content that is put out. Some very interesting names also lined up through the day, and these discussions are only going to get enriching, is something we can promise you. So are we ready to now?
I don't think so. We're just waiting for our next guest, Suesha. So let's just tell our viewers today, our audience today, a bit more about this first of a kind conclave. Now, let me tell you,